Caracas, Venezuela, a kilogram of beef costs 9.5 million bolivar. A monthly minimum wage is 5 million bolivar. A teacher, a nurse, a soldier, anyone on the government pay scale cannot buy 2 pounds of beef with an entire month's salary. The bolivar is losing half its value every 3 weeks. The central bank has stopped publishing inflation figures because the numbers have become too large for the standard reporting formats. The International Monetary Fund estimates annual inflation at 1 million%. That is not a typo. 1 million%. Hospitals are performing surgery without anesthesia because they cannot source the supplies. 3 million Venezuelans have left the country in the previous 4 years, and Venezuela sits on top of the largest confirmed oil reserves in the world. More than Saudi Arabia, more than Canada, more than Iraq, more proven oil than any nation on earth. A country with the largest oil reserves in the world cannot feed its people. It cannot supply its hospitals. It cannot keep its currency from dissolving in real time. And the specific policy sequence that converts the largest oil windfall in Venezuelan history into the deepest economic collapse in Latin American peacetime history is not a mystery. It is documented, sequenced, and analyzed. It is also a playbook that has been run in recognizable form in at least a dozen countries across a century of economic history. How does an oil windfall become mass starvation? And why does the specific mechanism that destroys Venezuela, the combination of price controls, nationalization, and monetary expansion to cover fiscal gaps, keep appearing in every resource-rich economy that tries to use natural wealth as a substitute for economic institutions? This is the story of Venezuela's collapse. By the end, you will understand the specific sequence that converts abundance into scarcity. See how the same sequence has operated in Zimbabwe, in Argentina, in Iran, and in smaller versions in a dozen other economies, and recognize the early indicators before the process reaches its terminal stage. But to understand how this happened, you have to go back, way back. It is the early 1970s, Caracas, Venezuela, and the city has the energy of a place that believes it is about to become something it has never been. The streets of Altamira and Chasao are lined with apartment towers going up alongside the arepas and corner stores. A city building itself faster than it can plan, funded by oil money that has been flowing since the 1920s, but accelerating sharply since OPEC's 1973 oil embargo quadrupled the price. The autopista Francisco Fajardo runs through the city's heart, a highway that is too modern for the traffic using it, which is itself too modern for what the country's infrastructure looked like a generation ago. Venezuela is, by the standards of Latin America, in 1973, a prosperous country. Its per capita income is the highest in the region. Its middle class is real and growing. Caracas has department stores that carry American goods at prices close to what you would pay in Miami. The Venezuelan economy in 1973 runs on one thing: oil. Petroleum accounts for approximately 90% of export earnings and provides the majority of government revenue through taxes and royalties on the foreign companies, primarily American and Dutch, that have been extracting Venezuelan oil since Standard Oil discovered commercial deposits in 1914. The government in Caracas controls the fiscal spigot but does not directly manage the extraction. A generation of Venezuelan economists and politicians has been arguing since the 1950s that the country needs to diversify its economy, to use oil revenues to build manufacturing, agriculture, and services that will generate income when the oil price falls or the oil runs out. The argument is correct. It has been made with increasing urgency for 20 years. It has produced almost no policy action, because oil money is easier to spend than it is to invest in the patient work of building industries that will take a decade to become competitive. Carlos Andrés Pérez becomes president in HYPERINFLATION, 1 year after the OPEC embargo, and he faces the exact problem that the Venezuelan economist Arturo Uslar Petri had identified in 1936, a country awash in oil, money with no mechanism for converting that money into durable economic development. Uslar Petri's phrase for what Venezuela needed to do was sembrar el petróleo, sow the oil, invest the windfall in productive capacity rather than consume it. Pérez announces a plan to do exactly that. He nationalizes the oil industry in 1976, creating Petróleos de Venezuela known as PEV, and commits to using the oil revenues to diversify the economy through a state-directed industrialization program. The nationalization is popular, the diversification program is funded, and then oil prices fall in the late 1970s, the debt accumulates, and the industrialization Program gets starved of funds at exactly the moment it needs sustained investment to produce results. The Venezuelan oil sector between 1976 and 1998 follows a curve that should be familiar from the Guano script. PDVSA, in its early years, is run with genuine technical competence by engineers and managers who came from the foreign oil companies and who maintain the production and operational standards they learned there. Venezuela's oil production through the 1980s and into the 1990s is stable. The company's accounts are professionally managed, and PDVSA develops a reputation as one of the better-run national oil companies in the world. A rare success story in the history of resource nationalization. But the oil price fall of the 1980s and the debt crisis that follows creates fiscal pressure on the Venezuelan government that pushes it toward PDVSA's cash flows, extracting dividends that constrain the company's ability to reinvest in maintenance, exploration, and expansion. The seeds of later production decline are planted during the lean years of the 1980s, when the infrastructure that sustained production in the 1970s begins aging without adequate replacement. Meet Rafael Caldera, who returns to the Venezuelan presidency in 1994 and inherits a banking system in crisis, an economy contracting at 3%, and a political environment shattered by 2 coup attempts in 1992, the second of which is led by a former military officer named Hugo Chavez. Caldera releases Chavez from prison in 1994 as part of a political amnesty, a decision he makes for reasons of political stabilization, and that will define the next 3 decades of Venezuelan history. Caldera's economic management is inconsistent. The banking crisis costs the government approximately 13% of GDP in bailout costs, and by the time of the 1998 election, the Venezuelan economy has contracted. Inflation is running at 36%, and the political class that has managed Venezuelan democracy since 1959 has exhausted whatever trust it had with the Venezuelan public. But Moises Naim sees what is coming earlier than almost anyone outside Venezuela. He is Venezuela's Minister of Trade and Industry in 1989 and 1990, an MIT-trained economist who later becomes editor of Foreign Policy magazine and writes extensively about the structural vulnerabilities of resource-dependent economies. In a 1993 paper he co-authors with Ramon P. He documents that oil dependency has produced what they call the Venezuelan paradox, a country that has earned an estimated $300 billion in oil revenues since 1960 and has a per capita income lower in real terms in 1993 than it was in 1960. Oil money has been spent, borrowed against, wasted on failed industrialization programs, and consumed in import booms. It has not built the productive capacity that would generate income independent of oil. The paradox is documented. The explanation is structural. The political will to address it does not exist in the pre-Chavez political system, and will not exist in the system that replaces it. What none of them know yet is that the oil price is about to do something that will make the structural problem invisible for 15 years while it gets worse. December 1998, Hugo Chavez wins the Venezuelan presidential election with 56% of the vote and the largest margin in 40 years, and nothing will ever be the same. At first, the Chavez economic program seems not just defensible but compelling. The Venezuela he inherits is one where the top 20% of earners receive 54% of national income and the bottom 40% receive 15%. The oil wealth that should have funded broad development has instead produced a politically connected elite and a large, frustrated poor majority. Chavez's promise is to redirect the oil revenues toward healthcare, education, food subsidies, and housing for the majority who have never benefited from the petroleum bounty. The policy instruments he uses in the first phase, the social programs funded by PDVSA dividends and government spending, deliver measurable improvements in literacy, infant mortality, and poverty rates between 2003 and 2007. The international academic literature on this period documents the improvements. Economists including Francisco Rodriguez, who serves as chief economist of the Venezuelan National Assembly under Chavez, later write papers establishing that the social gains during the oil boom years are real but that they are funded almost entirely by oil revenues rather than by improvements in the underlying productive capacity of the economy. The oil price does the work that policy cannot. Between 2003 and 2008, oil prices rise from $30 per barrel to $147 per barrel, a 5-fold increase. Venezuelan oil revenues in nominal terms more than quadruple. Government spending on social programs grows from approximately 7% of GDP to over 22% of GDP in the same period. Poverty rates fall from 54% to 28%, a number that every supporter of the Bolivarian Revolution correctly cites, and that every critic correctly notes, is built entirely on a commodity price that has no policy lever to sustain it. Venezuela's government has learnt nothing from the previous 400 years of resource boom economics. It is spending the oil price as if the oil price is a policy outcome rather than an externally determined number over which it has no control. The first structural intervention that will prove fatal is the Chavez government's relationship with PDVSA after a general strike in 2002 and 2003 in which PDVSA workers participate. Chavez fires approximately 19,000 PDVSA employees, roughly half the company's skilled workforce, and replaces them with politically loyal workers who lack the technical expertise of the people they replace. A 2004 International Energy Agency report on Venezuela documents the production disruption caused by the mass dismissals and notes that Venezuelan oil production, which had been approximately 3.5 million barrels per day in 2001, falls to approximately 2.4 million barrels per day by 2004 and never recovers to pre-strike levels. PDVSA is now an employment and social program as much as an oil company. Its revenues are redirected to fund the mission. Its investment budget is constrained. Its maintenance schedules slip. The production trajectory that results is structural and long-term. Venezuelan oil output declines at an accelerating rate for the next 15 years, falling to approximately 500,000 barrels per day by 2020, a decline of 85% from peak production. The second intervention is price controls. In 2003, facing inflation from the spending boom and political pressure from urban consumers, the Chavez government establishes price controls on a wide range of food and consumer goods. Price controls are a standard economic policy tool with a well-documented mechanism. When the government sets a maximum price below the market clearing price, suppliers reduce production or exit the market because they cannot cover their costs, and shortages result. Venezuelan economists, including Ricardo Hausmann at Harvard's Kennedy School, published papers in 2004 and 2005, predicting this outcome with specific reference to the Venezuelan controls. The shortages begin in 2004. The government's response is to expand the controlled product list and increase enforcement against retailers who charge above the controlled price. The shortages worsen. By 2007, basic goods including milk, cooking oil, flour, and sugar are periodically absent from supermarket shelves throughout the country. The third intervention is the nationalization wave. Between 2007 and 2012, the Chavez government nationalizes approximately 1,200 companies across sectors including steel, cement, food processing, telecommunications, banking, and agriculture. The nationalizations are conducted with varying degrees of compensation, some at negotiated prices and some through expropriation with disputed valuations. The common effect across the nationalized companies is a decline in productivity and output in the years following nationalization, a pattern documented in a 2015 study by economists at the Universidad Católica, Andrés Bello, using Venezuelan government production data. The decline is not universal across every nationalized company, but the aggregate effect is measurable and in the same direction. Productive capacity falls after nationalization, as management quality declines, investment drops, and political patronage replaces technical expertise in management decisions. By 2012, the architecture of the crisis is fully assembled. Oil production is declining. Price controls are producing shortages. Nationalized companies are producing less than the private ones they replaced. The government's fiscal gap, the difference between what the oil revenues bring in and what the spending programs cost, is being filled with money printed by the central bank. The money printing produces inflation. The inflation erodes purchasing power. The erosion of purchasing power hits the poor hardest, the same population that the social programs were designed to protect. Chavez wins re-election in October 2012 with 55% of the vote. He dies of cancer in March 2013. His successor, Nicolás Maduro, inherits the architecture and the trajectory. Oil prices fall from $100 per barrel in 2014 to $50 by early 2015 and to $30 by early 2016. The fiscal gap that the government had been covering with printed money which was manageable at $100 oil, becomes unmanageable at $30 oil. Money printing accelerates. Inflation, which was running at 70% in 2014, reaches 180% in 2015, 800% in 2016, and the IMF estimate of 1,000,000% in 2018. The Bolivar loses 99.99% of its value between 2012 and 2019. The government redenominates the currency twice, removing zeros from the notes, which allows it to print physically manageable banknotes but does nothing to the underlying monetary dynamics. A currency that loses 99.99% of its value in 7 years is a currency that no longer functions as a store of value or a unit of account. It is paper with numbers on it that change faster than markets can price them. Alejandro Flores ran a medium-sized dairy farm in the state of Aragua, 2,000 head of cattle, a milk processing operation, and distribution contracts with several supermarket chains. In 2008, the government sets the maximum price for a liter of pasteurized milk at a level below his cost of production. He applies for a price increase through the regulatory process. The process takes 14 months and results in an approval for a 12% increase against an inflation rate of 32% that year. He reduces his herd. By 2013, it is 800 head. By 2016, the farm is not operating as a dairy because the economics of producing milk under the price control cannot be made to work. He has converted part of the land to subsistence food production for his family and workers. His distribution contracts are long since cancelled. His supermarket customers are buying whatever product arrives from state distribution networks, which is unreliable and often expired. Carmen Vasquez is a retired schoolteacher in Valencia, who receives a government pension that in 2012 covers her basic expenses comfortably. By 2016, the pension covers 2 weeks of groceries. By 2018, it covers 2 days. She is not an opponent of the government. She voted for Chavez in 4 elections. She has 2 daughters who send her money from Colombia where they have emigrated. Without the remittances, she would not eat. She does not blame anyone specific. She blames the price of things, as if the price has a will of its own, independent of any human decision. Francisco Rodriguez, the former chief economist of the National Assembly, publishes a detailed analysis in 2018 estimating that Venezuelan per capita income has fallen by 40% in real terms since 2013, a contraction comparable in scale to the Great Depression in the United States. He notes that the contraction occurs not because of external sanctions, which are not imposed until 2017, but because of the accumulated effect of the domestic policy decisions taken between 2003 and 2013, whose consequences could not be deferred indefinitely once the oil price fell. And still, nobody asked the real question, so what does the conventional story say about Venezuela's collapse? The story told by critics of the Chavez and Maduro governments is that socialism destroyed a prosperous country. The story told by defenders is that US sanctions destroyed a revolutionary experiment. Both stories contain some true facts, and both stories stop at the point where the analysis requires acknowledging something more uncomfortable than a political enemy, that Venezuela's crisis is the terminal outcome of a specific policy sequence that can be run by left-wing governments, right-wing governance, and authoritarian governments of various kinds, and that the sequence has the same outcome regardless of the political label attached to the government running it. Remember Moises Naim's 1993 analysis of the Venezuelan paradox. He documents that Venezuela earned $300 billion in oil revenues between 1960 and 1993, and emerged from the period poorer in real per capita terms than it entered. The Chavez period adds approximately another $700 billion in oil revenues between 1999 and 2013, and produces the same outcome at higher speed. The first oil cycle depleted the wealth slowly, through accumulated debt, failed industrialization programs, and consumption of the windfall. The second oil cycle depletes it faster, through price controls that destroy productive capacity, nationalizations that reduce output, monetary expansion that dissolves the currency's purchasing power, and the conversion of PDVSA from an oil company into a patronage vehicle that can no longer sustain its own operations. The mechanism runs through 3 interconnected failures that compound each other. Price controls suppress the price signal that tells producers whether to produce, invest, and expand. When the price signal is suppressed below cost, production falls. When production falls, supply shrinks. When supply shrinks, the gap between supply and demand is filled either by imports, by rationing, or by shortages. Venezuela's government fills the gap with imports funded by oil revenues, which works while oil prices are high and fails catastrophically when they fall. The nationalization wave removes the private sector's capacity to respond to the supply gaps because the state-owned replacements lack the capital, management quality, and operational incentives to fill them, and the monetary expansion that covers the fiscal gap between oil revenues and spending commitments destroys the currency as a store of value, which destroys savings, destroys investment, and destroys every economic agent's ability to make multi-year plans. The new paradigm in Venezuela's case is not a financial belief but a political one. The belief, held by both the Chavez government and its most committed supporters, that the distributional failures of Venezuela's pre-1998 political economy could be corrected by redirecting oil revenues through the state rather than through markets, and that the resource curse mechanics that had destroyed Venezuelan prosperity in the previous 4 decades were the product of corrupt elites mismanaging the windfall, rather than of structural features of resource-dependent economies that persist regardless of who manages the windfall. Easy money is the oil price surge between 2003 and 2008, which provides a fiscal space so large that the productivity-destroying effects of the price controls and the post-strike PDVSA dismantling are invisible in the aggregate data. GDP grows, poverty falls, the currency holds. The structural deterioration is happening underneath the surface while the numbers look fine, in exactly the pattern that Manuel Pardo described in 1860s Peru and that Jorge Cardenas described in 1990 Segundos, Colombia Social. Proof is the electoral validation of the Bolivarian revolution in 10 consecutive national elections between 1998 and 2013, including multiple international observer-certified contests, which provides democratic legitimacy to a policy program whose economic effects are long-term and whose short-term distributional benefits are real and directly experienced by the electorate. Complexity is the administrative architecture of price controls, foreign exchange controls, import licensing, and nationalized distribution networks that the Venezuelan government builds between 2003 and 2015, which is opaque enough that no independent analyst can build a complete model of how goods flow through the economy and where the shortages are concentrated until they become visible in empty supermarket shelves. Peak euphoria arrives in 2007 and 2008, when oil is at its peak and Chavez's social program gains are at their most visible, when Venezuela's foreign reserves are over $40 billion, when the government's credit rating allows it to borrow internationally at reasonable rates, and when academic economists including Joseph Stiglitz are visiting Caracas and expressing measured approval of the distributional outcomes of the Bolivarian programs. The warning that gets dismissed most publicly is a 2008 paper by Ricardo Hausmann and Francisco Rodriguez in the Journal of International Economics, published before the oil price fall, establishing that Venezuela's poverty reduction during the boom years is entirely attributable to the oil windfall rather than to improvements in economic structure, and predicting that a fall in oil prices would reverse the gains at high speed. The paper receives hostile responses from Venezuelan government economists and is dismissed in official communications as ideologically motivated. Trigger is the oil price fall of 2014 to 2016, which reduces Venezuelan fiscal revenues by approximately 65% in 2 years and makes visible the gap between spending commitments and revenue reality that the printed money had been papering over. Since at least 2012, the blame game is one of the more complex in modern economic history. The Venezuelan government blames U.S. sanctions, an economic war by domestic opposition, falling oil prices caused by American fracking, and the legacy of pre-Chavez elite mismanagement. The opposition blames state socialism. International economists blame the specific policy sequence regardless of political label. The poor in Caracas who cannot find food in the stores blame the stores, the government, the opposition, the Americans, and God, in varying proportions depending on the day and the neighborhood. Once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. Now look at 2025. Zimbabwe's new currency, the Zimbabwe Gold or ZiG, introduced in April 2024 as the country's 6th attempt at a stable currency since the original Zimbabwe dollar collapsed in 2009, has already depreciated by 80% against the US dollar within its first 6 months of existence. Zimbabwe is not Venezuela. It has a different history, different institutions, different commodity profile, but the sequence it has run since 2000 maps onto the Venezuelan sequence with uncomfortable precision. Land seizures that destroy agricultural productive capacity, price controls that produce shortages, monetary expansion to cover fiscal gaps, currency collapse, dollarization as an emergency measure, and then a partial de-dollarization that restarts the sequence. The ZIG's 6-month collapse in 2024 is the latest chapter in a 25-year document of what happens when a government's spending commitments consistently exceed its capacity to generate revenue from a productive economy. Sound familiar? New paradigm. The current version is the belief, operating in several lower-income economies currently experiencing high inflation and currency pressure, that a new currency backed by gold or a commodity basket can resolve a fiscal credibility problem that is structural rather than monetary. The ZIG's backing by gold reserves was genuine at launch. The gold reserves were not large enough to cover the fiscal gap that was being monetized. A currency backed by a commodity does not solve a fiscal problem. It converts the fiscal problem into a commodity depletion problem. And the timeline is longer, but the outcome is the same. Easy money is the external financing, from China, from the IMF, from bilateral creditors, that allows governments running structural fiscal deficits to defer the adjustment that the deficit requires. Zimbabwe has received approximately $2 billion in external support since 2020 without it producing a sustainable fiscal adjustment, because the adjustment requires either revenue growth that depends on an economy that is not growing, or spending cuts that are politically impossible without the kind of institutional reform that the current government has not undertaken. Complexity is the web of currency controls, parallel exchange rates, price controls on specific sectors, and state trading monopolies that most high-inflation economies build in response to the symptoms of the underlying fiscal problem, each of which addresses a specific market distortion at the cost of creating new ones, until the administrative apparatus required to manage the controls exceeds the government's capacity to administer it, and the controls begin failing simultaneously. What is genuinely different in Zimbabwe's case from Venezuela? Zimbabwe does not sit on the largest oil reserves in the world. Its commodity base is mining, particularly platinum and gold, which cannot fund a patronage state at Venezuelan scale. The smaller resource base limits the duration of the easy money phase, which means the fiscal reckoning arrives faster and at a smaller total loss of productive capacity. Venezuela's oil wealth extended the boom phase long enough to dismantle PDVSA, nationalize 1,200 companies, and build price control infrastructure across the entire consumer economy. Zimbabwe's much smaller windfall cannot fund that scale of structural dismantlement. Whether this is an advantage is a question the Zimbabwe gold's depreciation curve will answer. Watch for any economy where the gap between the official and parallel exchange rate exceeds 50%, because that gap is the market's measure of how much the government's stated monetary policy differs from its actual fiscal policy. Watch for government-reported inflation figures that diverge significantly from independent estimates, because the gap between official and independent inflation is a measure of how much the government is willing to falsify the signal that prices send to economic agents. And watch for any economy where fuel, food, or electricity subsidies consume more than 10% of GDP, because that scale of subsidy implies a fiscal position that is sustainable only at commodity prices well above current levels, and commodity prices are not sustainable at any specific level. Not predictions. A pattern. The pattern is there. The question is whether you will recognize it in time. So why do we keep making this sequence of decisions? The individual steps are each defensible in isolation. Price controls hold down the cost of living for poor consumers. That is a good thing. Nationalizing oil companies captures resource rents for public benefit rather than private enrichment. That is a reasonable goal. Redirecting state revenues toward healthcare and education for previously excluded populations produces measurable improvements in human welfare. That is documented fact. The problem is that each step, taken in sequence and in combination, produces a systemic outcome that no one step predicts. The price controls that protect poor consumers drive out the producers who supply them. The nationalization that captures resource rents degrades the resource extraction that generates the rents. The social spending that reduces poverty in the boom years creates fiscal commitments that cannot survive the bust. And the monetary expansion that covers the gap between the commitments and the revenue destroys the currency that denominates everyone's savings. Wages and prices. Carmen Vasquez, the retired teacher who cannot eat without her daughter's remittances, voted for Chavez because she believed the social programs would sustain themselves. She was not wrong to believe that during the oil boom. She was wrong in the same way that every generation of resource boom beneficiaries is wrong. She trusted that abundance was a condition rather than a cycle, that the windfall was the beginning of something rather than the borrowed time it turned out to be. The specific failure of judgment is not hers. It is the institutional one. Every government that has managed a resource boom has faced the same choice between consuming the windfall and investing it, and most of them have chosen consumption, because consumption delivers political benefits today and investment delivers economic benefits in 10 years, and no political system is patient enough to prefer the tenure. Return the countries that have managed resource windfalls without this outcome. Share 1. Feature that Venezuela, Nigeria, Peru, and most other resource-dependent economies lack an institutional constraint that separates the resource revenues from the political spending cycle. Norway's sovereign wealth fund is the most cited example, but Botswana's management of diamond revenues, Chile's copper stabilization fund, and Alaska's permanent fund all follow the same principle. Take the resource revenue out of the annual political budget cycle and subject it to governance rules that prevent it from being consumed by current political coalitions. The principle is simple. The institutional capacity required to implement and maintain it against the constant political pressure to spend the money now is anything but. Alejandro Flores's dairy farm is now producing some milk again for the domestic Aragua market, paid in US dollars after Venezuela's de facto dollarization in 2019. The cows are fewer. The equipment is older. The distribution infrastructure is a fraction of what it was. He is not rebuilding. He is surviving. The productive capacity that took decades to build and 5 years of price controls to destroy does not come back quickly. Agricultural and industrial capital is not like financial capital. It cannot be restored by a policy announcement. It requires years of sustained, ordinary operation by people who have not yet left the country. And Venezuela's most productive generation, the engineers, doctors, farmers, teachers, and managers who left between 2015 and 2023, is now building lives somewhere else. Their departure is not a political statement. It is a rational response to an environment where productive effort is not rewarded and where the currency in which effort is compensated dissolves before it can be saved. Now, I want to hear from you. Which economy currently running price controls, currency controls, or large commodity-funded spending programs do you think is closest to the point where the fiscal gap between commitments and revenues becomes unmanageable? And what single institutional reform, if implemented credibly, would most reduce the probability of that economy running the Venezuelan sequence to its terminal outcome? The question is not academic. There are probably 15 economies right now where the answer matters to tens of millions of people. Drop the specific country and the specific reform in the comments. If this changed how you read the next story about hyperinflation or shortages in any country, hit the like button and subscribe. Next time, we are going inside the story of how a single Dutch trading company became the first corporation in history to sell shares to the public, built a private army larger than most national militaries, and then collapsed in a scandal that destroyed the Dutch government with it. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, it is rhyming loud. See you in the next one.